The topics of this panel is about one of the main aspects I think that we have to discuss and to face, because it has to do with alternative currencies, the idea to provide a sort of alternative financial monetary system able to keep sustainable all the alternative economics we had discussed in the previous panels, from in answer to precarious labor with the introduction of a basic income hypothesis, for instance, cooperativism, and the reappropriation of urban space and commons. All these kind of goals needs to be supported by some instruments. And of course, in the financial monetary economy, we cannot avoid it to discuss about alternative financial tools. That is the reason why this panel is the last one, but it's the last one just to start a beginning discussion tomorrow. So the first, I'm very happy to present here the first speaker, that is Professor Robert Meister from the University of Santa Cruz, University of California, at Santa Cruz in California, of course.
In California.
Thank you very much.
Okay. The title of this talk is Plenty for Everyone, and I mean this title to be a response to the politics of austerity, which I understand to be of considerable interest here in Greece. Now, taking a long view, I think that financial austerity is a strategy for removing the option of justice from national politics at precisely those moments when it could otherwise be most forcefully demanded. The presumed reason for sidestepping justice is, of course, that it is something that we can no longer afford at times when the entire economy is threatened with collapse, at times when everyone must pull together to save the entire economy from collapse in much the way that we might do if Wall Street and its counterparts in other countries were subject to a terrorist attack or a malicious virus. I want to present you with an outline of my alternative approach to justice during financial crises by using the logic of finance, and especially of options theory, to restore historical justice as a political project that is especially important in times such as these. Now, here in somewhat telegraphic form is my developing view. First point, financialized capitalism, like its predecessors, tends to preserve and to increase the cumulative value of past injustice without, however, appearing to perpetuate that injustice. It is this compounding effect of historical injustice that should be of greatest concern to those of us on the left. Second point, a socialist response must ask why these cumulative gains should accrue so largely to the ongoing beneficiaries of past injustice. It must then present the demand for justice itself as an option on the accumulated wealth of society, and not merely as a claim for a more equitable distribution of the income derived from goods and services. Third point, to be politically effective, socialism also needs to understand the forms of hands-on power that could be used collectively to threaten financial disaccumulation, by which I mean asset price collapse, and to do this in much the way that the option of a general strike once threatened the disaccumulation of industrial capital by making investments in plant and material useless. If the welfare state was the political price exacted for not exercising the option of a general strike, there should also be a political price for not exercising the option to bring on a liquidity crisis by collective action aimed at occupying, by which I mean more fully possessing, the forms of collateral that are presently in our control, in our hands, and that the financial system literally counts on being able to repossess. And this includes, of course, the collateral for our own debts, but it also includes the expected payments that we may make on those debts, which function as collateral for other debts. Fourth, we can now approximately measure the political price of restoring liquidity. In my country in 2008, the US government preserved the liquidity of global money markets, the shadow banking system, by swapping from 5 to 13 trillion of illiquid private debt for government debt, thereby providing the financial system with a supply of safe collateral that it very badly needed. Sixth, in financial terms, this swap meant quite simply that the general formula for pricing all financial options, the famous Black-Scholes-Merton formula, had become a technology for manufacturing synthetic public debt, the privatized equivalents of US treasuries, and manufacturing it out of private credit and other forms of capital. While these synthetic treasuries became illiquid and thus worth less than government obligations, their theoretical equivalents had to be performed, which looks forward to our next panel, performed and thus made true by swapping these synthetic US treasuries for real US treasuries at par in whatever quantities were necessary to stabilize the financial markets. Sixth, politically, this meant that the capitalist state no longer borrows more in order to spend more, as it did in the high days of Keynesian capitalism. In austerity capitalism, it rather spends less so that it can borrow more cheaply. Here, the option of justice is taken off the table, by which I mean quite rigorously valued at zero, in order to use the state's debt-creating power to preserve the liquidity of capital markets and thus the value of accumulated wealth. 7, a socialist response to austerity capitalism would think creatively about liquidity crisis as the choke point of financialized capitalism. Think creatively, that is to say, by understanding that a liquidity crisis threatens to destroy up to 100% of the market value of accumulated wealth, because without a market, it would be valued at zero. Wasn't the restoration of liquidity a nationalization of the means of financial production that then redirected and reprivatized flows of funds and collateral instead of socializing them? And couldn't socialism then be conceived as a coordinated response, a response at the level of policy, at the level of creative communities, at the level of social movements, that uses the techniques of finance to subvert and reverse its own tendency to widen the cumulative effects of past injustice? Doesn't the increased vulnerability of the financial system to sabotage at its choke points require those who may be willing to engage in such actions to do so using collective techniques, communal techniques, that make a strong enough claim to justice to counteract the attempt to essentially assimilate our actions to industrial sabotage in the way that strikes were assimilated to or financial sabotage in a way that strikes were once assimilated to industrial sabotage. We are talking here of extracting a political price for rolling over rather than exercising the option of justice viewed as an illiquidity event. And that price should be roughly comparable to what the terrorist bankers on Wall Street exacted in 2008 when they threatened to blow themselves up along with the global financial system if they could not exchange bad private sector debt for risk-free government obligations at 100 cents on the dollar. What was that price? Well, the notional value of the collateral swap was essentially what was necessary to preserve the value of the total credit market debt of the US, which is 5 to 7 times GDP. The premium paid for the swap was something between 7 and 13 trillion in pledged and actually transferred assets. But there was no premium paid to the public for making accumulated gains continue to run. This means that the amount available to finance historical redress is potentially very large if we consider it to be, in this instance, the price that the US public should have received for recollateralizing capital markets instead of undergoing or bringing about a political crisis that would have made them illiquid. How great would this price have been if it had been paid to the public rather than to the banks? Well, it's plenty, because the price needs to be paid not as a redistribution of taxable income arising from GDP, but rather as a redirection of the flow of funds and collateral that would change the beneficiaries of accumulated wealth while leaving its magnitude essentially unchanged. The point is quite simply, whether it's 5 million or 13 trillion or something in between, that there's plenty to go around if we treat historical justice as an option that has not been permanently foregone and organize our politics accordingly during periods of austerity. Now, since the financial crisis, I have been vehemently opposed to the view, quite common on the left, that we are the wrong people living at the wrong time for historical justice. I believe that the option of justice, which is simply what it costs, the premium that must be paid to maintain the liquidity of wealth arising from past injustice, that option has never been more valuable than it is today. Austerity, therefore, means that the liquidity premium necessary to preserve the value of accumulated wealth is being harvested by the beneficiaries of capital rather than its victims. It is up to thinkers and activists like those gathered here today to organize around the choke point of financial liquidity so as to be able to extract a political price for preserving it. Above all, I think we must stop thinking of justice as something that our respective societies can no longer afford at times of financial crisis. On the contrary, the present value of justice as an option is precisely the amounts that our societies have already proven they are willing to pay at such moments in order to maintain the liquidity of financial markets without subjecting those markets to severe disaccumulation. This means essentially that justice is whatever it is that society can afford to preserve liquidity. The question is not how much. We already know the amounts. The market has set the price. It is rather to whom these amounts must be paid if the threats to sabotage the financial system do not come mainly, as they have in the past, from the financiers themselves. To answer through both direct action and political organization is, I think, the challenge before us today. And there is no better place to begin than here in Greece. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.